Hello and welcome to Dual Citizens. My name is David Ould.
And I'm Stephen McAlpine.
What are we looking at this week? Well, it is 2 years now since the famous and, dare we say it, controversial Dobbs ruling in the United States Supreme Court, which overturned Roe versus Wade, the 50-year-old right of people to have abortions in America. We're going to be thinking about what's happened in those last 2 years. Have the predictions come true? Is it a handmaid's tale all over America? And what can the church learn from those last 24 months?
Well, David, two futures were envisaged post Roe versus Wade. One was the obvious one of the handmaid's tale of patriarchy and women just being baby machines. And then the other one was a great rejoicing, obviously among pro-life groups who said that we would now move abortion to the states and the will of the people, and that it would probably be overturned because no one wanted Roe versus Wade in the first place. How has this panned out? What's actually happened, Dave, compared to what people thought might happen?
Well, it's been fascinating, hasn't it? Steve, last time we met, we talked about just how polarized the United States political scene is. And it turns out the expectations of what will happen were also very, very polarized. As you say, sort of some people thinking that we're going to, get all this Handmaid's Tale stuff going on, and others thinking this is the end of the journey and the pro-life movement has won. Turns out really neither of those. What actually happened was what the Supreme Court said should happen, which is that this isn't something that's in the Constitution itself, and therefore a matter that should be debated and legislated in the states. So just classic US constitutional stuff. The outcome, of course, of that has been really interesting. In some states, they have been legislating for abortion rights or against them. And in other places, it's not happened. What we've actually seen remarkably is an increase in the number of abortions in America since the Dobbs ruling. It's actually increased. And we're wondering why that is. Is it possible that actually people are more active about going and getting them? They've been traveling over state lines, making use of another constitutional right, the right to travel, and all these different things have been going on. So we're nowhere more forward. We haven't progressed really if you're an ardent pro-lifer in one sense. The only people that seem to have won are the constitutionalists.
We're going to get to some of the cultural stuff behind it, but there were a few articles a few years ago, actually, I noticed from the New York Times, which were more prescient about it, saying that at least it is pushing it back to the states, because the progressives in the media were actually quite confident that in the 50 years things had changed. And we will get to that, but let's keep with the court for the moment. There's a real progressive push among the Democrats at the moment to change the makeup and how the Supreme Court is decided upon, its members. It seems to be when you can call foul when you're not winning, but you keep the system when you're winning. Talk us a little bit through how the Supreme Court nominations work and why that's important in this instance.
Sure. So there's 9 members of the Supreme Court, and effectively it's an appointment for life. The president makes a nomination, and then it's got to be ratified by the Senate of the United States. And typically it goes through, but being president basically means you get to pick who your Supreme Court nominees and therefore justices are. And that therefore means that, sadly, like everything else in the United States, it's a politicized issue. So Republicans pick Republican-leaning justices and Democrats pick Democrat-leaning justices. It just so happened that Donald Trump got 3 picks in the 4 years while he was president, and that shifted the whole court to a 6-3 balance. But there are now 3 justices that are in their 70s, and there is some debate now, probably the next presidential term, maybe 2 future nominations, which could swing the court right back the other way. So it's game on, and because in the current political climate in the US, so many things are pushed all the way up to the Supreme Court, they become important choices that a president gets to make.
Yes, that struck me very strongly, that if you had another president in a certain direction and say 4 people had to retire or died or whatever, it's culture that's shaping everything, not legislation per se. That it seems that many of the issues, say same-sex marriage issue with Justice Kennedy's statement about what marriage was a very different understanding of marriage culturally. But if you look back to 1973, Roe v. Wade was decided by a very male, pale and stale justice.
Yes.
That's interesting.
Yeah, there is this shift. And also, I think it's probably worth observing that it seems to me, you get two different approaches to what the function of the Supreme Court is. Those who are more towards the political right wing see the Supreme Court as really as someone that's there to uphold the Constitution, and because they have a more conservative view, that means a stepping back from getting involved in things, really saying, well, what freedoms do people have and asserting those, whereas the left is increasingly speaking about the Supreme Court almost as though it's another legislative body. It's legislating things like round the back, so that we can't get stuff through Congress. Let's get it through the Supreme Court. It's a very different view to how the judicial works.
That's a progressive trope around the West, to be honest, because you see it in Australia as well. Now, what about absolutely. Christians in the response to Roe v. Wade in the last 2 years? First Things magazine, Catholic journal, talking about it, but saying, and First Things is very obviously in the public square. How do you think Christians have responded, and are they getting what they hope to get, or do you think it's just shifted the things around?
It's interesting. They have got this what they call a symposium article with lots of different speakers in it. Everybody from Al Mohler on sort of the Protestant right through to Roman Catholic bishops, all giving their opinion. It was an interesting read, and I think it's worth our viewers looking through. There's various degrees of realism, I think, about what's going on. And I think the most astute observations are going, well, look, you just can't legislate for people's hearts. And so the real battle isn't anywhere near over. All that the Supreme Court decision has done is cascade the right to make this choice down to the states, where the debate is still on. People's hearts are still being engaged. All the things that bend the way that people choose to vote on this issue, they're all still there. The therapeutic culture that Truman speaks about, emotions being the key thing, the debates about what the fetus is, and this battle of rights, my rights versus the fetus, which is kind of where the debate has landed now. Those are all still in play. And so I think the wisest Christians there just going, we've got to see that. We therefore need brave political leaders who are going to stand up. But we still need to win hearts and minds on the fundamental issue itself.
Yeah, because there'll always be a way around it, right? And I guess always. In my upbringing, old enough to remember sex ed in class where everyone was told a fetus is just a bunch of cells. No one really even argues that if you said in the setting, well, actually, it's a potential human, people are going, that's fine. The issue is whose rights trump whose rights. And that's the main argument today. It's not about whether it's human life or where it begins. I think
that's right.
Seems to be, that's a shift.
I think that's right, Steve. I mean, you still hear the argument, don't you? But you hear it in the kind of way that sort of, National Geographic channel sort of does 10-year-old ideas on the Bible and historicity when the rest of us are way past it. No, those at the forefront of this debate, they're not in that space anymore. It is all about, well, we shouldn't be surprised by this. It's all about autonomy. It's all about me being the arbiter of my own universe. And that's still a very fresh debate going on in our culture.
And in our culture, which we're going to come back and look at, why has a US decision 2 years ago, it had reverberations around the rest of the West in particular, and some anxiety-ridden claims. We're going to look at that in a moment.
Well, that sounds like a great segue, Steve. So how come when a bunch of stuffy lawyers in the US make a, frankly, quite boring and technical decision about the way that their own constitution works, how come we're so excited about it here in Australia? That's what we want to turn to. Steve, we often mention on this podcast how when America sneezes, then the rest of the world catches a cold, at least the Western world. And we kind of just assume that's true. Let's stop for a moment and ask ourselves, why is that? What do you reckon?
Oh, if I had a couple of hours on this podcast, I'd tell you. Look, clearly, the rest of the West takes its cues from America in love and hate. I think, culturally, because America set itself up as self-consciously a new way of looking at the world, and it's the new world. Uh, if you look at the art from the start of America's paintings, it's ironic. There's a great book about the history of American art called American Visions, and the first paintings, America looked Edenic. It really was the new world. So new ideas from the new world is going to set a new post sort of medieval, post ancient world. And de Tocqueville, of course, speaks about how American culture and the way they do things was the way to go. So we've taken our cues from America for good or for ill. So when they get something wrong, we anguish because we hold them to a higher standard. And when they get something right, we sort of all follow suit. And so this issue clearly bleeds out into the rest of the West, but that overlooks some of the way decisions are made in other countries. The Constitution of the US is to do with the US, but clearly it's become a lightning rod, a cultural lightning rod around the rest of the world, these sorts of decisions.
Right. So how has that then impacted the rest of the world? And I think particularly we think the Western world, and obviously we want to talk a lot about here in Australia. How has it energized debate here? And in that light, how do we work out in our culture that's so influenced by that culture, how we push forward the laws that we need to protect life here?
Well, a couple of things you'd learn from the American situation is everyone is saying we need to get legislation through Parliament to make sure that it doesn't happen here. And there already is legislation in Parliament that frees people to have abortion, clearly. And it would seem that in the rest of the West, it's not as hot a topic. It's far more privatized. It feels less in your face, even though it's an issue, and it's a complex issue. But I also think that in terms of right to life, how we navigate that will be less hostile in the culture wars than in the United States. Christians have to think about how we do public square theology really well in Australia. And I think we're behind the eight ball. Most people in Australia are, I don't care, I don't want to know about it, it's a private issue. And that's, in fact, what the Constitution in 1973 decided, that this was a privacy issue. And then it rolled out that way. So I think the rest of the West is actually, in some countries, much more conservative around the timing of abortion and late-term abortion. But the idea that somehow we hold to all life is human life and viability is the issue is probably gone. I think most people now go, it's about human rights, it's about autonomy and the individual person. And much of that has flowed from the West.
Well, let's move towards that. I mean, what's possibly interesting here is that the Dobbs decision, by almost freeing up the states to have this debate again and catalyzing the question for the rest of us, has kind of exposed where we're now at. And some people may have optimistically thought, oh, well, Roe versus Wade kind of kept and suppressed this basically pro-life view that many people have. It held it down, and it would be released after the Dobbs decision. Turns out not so much. And there has been this underlying shift in the way that we as a culture think about things. So why are we kind of where we're at the moment? What's missing from perhaps the things that we need to be talking about in order to have this conversation properly?
Well, what it means to be human is up for grabs, and how we do life in community towards those who are the weakest in the culture. You can see why women who are pro-choice, to use the term, the euphemism, can say, well, men aren't taking any responsibility. But that's part of a bigger ecosystem of how we do life and relationships together. I think, too, that it's also true that when you change laws, over time you change people's minds and you change hearts. So when you normalize that this is a right, give it 60 years and it becomes one, right? So the water we swim in is very different to the days that it happened. And so anyone who was thinking that the great American majority was suppressed in its decision against abortion has to realize that laws change how you think about things. And when you put things in place, over time, it embeds those ideas in us, and you pile that on with other ideas about, under the iceberg tip of abortion, about autonomy, you do you. It seems natural that abortion is part of that framework. So it's not as if I think there's going to be any switch back anytime soon that is outside are completely reframing of what it means to be human. And that doesn't seem to be happening in the West anytime soon. So I think the issue of abortion is actually embedded in much deeper issues about what it means to be human, what human flourishing is, the goal of being a human, and who gets to decide it. Those are massive questions that are no longer taken for granted as the common ideas.
So that's the underlying issues that people have to, if they're asking themselves the questions, they have to ask themselves. They then present in the sort of the key issues that we debate and the legislation that we vote for. It's not just abortion at start of life, is it? It's also the euthanasia question at end of life that we're acting.
End of life, start of life. And
look, yeah. Where's it all going, do you reckon, Steve?
Look, I think that when you look at the end of life questions, there will be more euthanasia for more groups of people based on the sweet smell of autonomy. People aren't going to make euthanasia decisions based on we're going to become a nasty culture. They're doing it on the basis of we're becoming a free culture. Now, look, I've got skin in the game in the sense that, my mum was born out of wedlock in a strict religious house who didn't have any grace to give her or the family. And, her parents spirited away and gave her away. And my mum has a friend who had 8 abortions before she became a Christian. And when she became a Christian, she was 4 months pregnant. My mum talked her out of having an abortion, and she's got a beautiful, 25, 30-year-old son. So no one is immune from these decisions. It's not as if you can't talk about this because you're not, a childbearing female. These are human decisions, and that's not going to go away.
That's right. Well, as you've just mentioned right now, the church has got form, hasn't it? It's done it well in the past. It's maybe done it not so well as well. Maybe we'll move next to thinking about how we can learn from the past and look to the future. So let's think through what the church itself should do. It's not like we don't have any track record in this area. We've been doing things in the space of human life and protecting it for a long, long time. And indeed, long before, Steve, we even had any such thing as democratic rights and the votes and the chance to influence the legislation that was going on. Nevertheless, what can we learn from the church in the past on this issue?
Well, in the first couple of centuries, when you read casually read comments by Roman soldiers writing home to their pregnant wife saying, if it's a girl, expose it. If it's a boy, keep it. You realize that human life was viewed very differently. And the lens that the church then brought, as Tom Holland has often pointed out, was of the human rights of every human being made in the image of God. So somewhere along the line, the church has to lean deep into its creation theology and say, that's not just a church matter. That's what we believe publicly about all human life. And that changed the nature of our culture, whether or not you're a Christian or not. So I think we need to be in the public square about it. And we need to be teaching in church about what's below the tip of the abortion iceberg, if that makes sense. You can't have a conversation about that issue if you don't have common ground about what it means to be human, whether you feel that, whether that's with a Christian or not a Christian. Because what you're going to find is that many Christians, their default is pretty much not far from where the wider culture holds about what it means to be human and autonomy. That's a big issue.
It's huge, isn't it? So where should we actually go with this, Steve? Like, how should we be treating these start and end of life issues? I think it's probably just worth stopping as we ask that question and going, it's been an interesting conversation so far because we've arranged all over this abortion topic in a sense, and yet not actually, I think deliberately you and I have made the choice to this point not to actually step right into it and, as it were, tell a woman what to do with her body, because we're first and foremost interested with what's under the surface on the iceberg. The tip of the iceberg is, well, what do you and do you not do? But underneath we're going, what's going on there? What are the things that are being debated? What are the influences? Let's help Christians to understand why the tip of the iceberg looks like it does. But as we view the whole iceberg, where should we be going with it, Steve?
Well, I think we need to. I do think we need to work in the legislative place as well, because I think legislation changes us emotionally over time in a way that we haven't realised. Because many of the messages you get about this issue are emotively driven. Carl Trueman talks about the aesthetics of ethics, and that we lost the aesthetic ethics fight, he says, with same-sex marriage. But he says it's much more up in the air. about abortion, because a sonogram allows you to literally view a human being very early on, and you see something that looks far more human than you were told. So I think it's a long-term game. I think the church has to be aware that it's going to have people that come to it who have had abortions and have felt bad about it. And it's also going to have people in the midst of their congregation who they wouldn't have a clue about. So you've got to deal with it pastorally. I do think it's a 2 or 3 pronged approach. Good teaching on it, and it's got to have some way. That Stanley Hauerwas said that in 100 years' time, if the church is known as a group of people that didn't kill its young and didn't kill its old, we'll be doing a good thing. We're probably there 90 years ahead of his statement.
Yeah.
There's something about the way we do church in the public square which speaks out for life, and also shows it in its context inside. And look, the argument that if you need to adopt all the children or else shut up, I don't think it's a good argument.
No. One of the things that struck me when I looked at this quite a few years ago was just the parallels with the slavery and the abolitionist argument there. And even just in the campaigning method that the church chose. I mean, and part of it was the thing you've been talking about, just seeing the reality of the situation, thinking about what actually is going on here. So one of the most effective campaign methods that the abolitionists had was just to show you the genuine humanity of those people who were being enslaved. So Wedgwood with the famous plate, "Am I not a man and your brother?" And just the pictures of the slave ships, showing what conditions people were carried in over from Africa to the Americas. So there's that pointy part of it. But yeah, underneath it that's all pushing, isn't it, to that basic underlying question where we're trying to work out what is it that we're talking about here when we talk about this abortion matter. And it's difficult, isn't it? Because lots of people are being hurt by it, not just the children themselves, obviously, but also many of the people around it. How should the church be treating those people, Steve, who are framed by these issues or involved in them? You spoke about your mum and her friend, but there's loads of them out there.
A couple of things. I think obviously it comes down to what we believe about humans to begin with, and then enacting that. So I would say my mum, for example, encouraged someone not to have an abortion, and then she spent a good time of her life helping that woman and looking after her, and then helping her when she had her child. So I think that's important to do. And that's a key issue to do. How do you show the equivalent of a slave ship or a slave in a context where if you immediately showed an abortion technique, it's game over, I think, because of the horror of what that is. And most people have never seen anything like that and don't go there. So it feels like it's still very much don't want to talk about it, don't want to know about it. It's a secret issue.
It's interesting, Steve. Sorry to interrupt you. I did it on my website a few years ago on this basis, and I said I had an obscured picture of the outcome of an abortion, but I said, if you want to see it, click on here, you'll get the full picture. It's really interesting, the feedback I got back, including from Christians who I had no doubt were with me on the issue. We're in a different place now, aren't we?
Yes, and that's what we're going to have to say. We are going to not have to educate people per se. We're going to have to re-educate a whole generation whose default emotionally, even if they don't say it's their default theologically, is don't go there, don't talk about it. It's a private issue. Whereas we know that the community is affected by private issues when they mount up. When there's a million private issues, that's a community issue. And it shapes and changes the way we think about ourselves, about the weakest among us, as does the euthanasia debate. And it will shape us beyond what we know going forward, which is why I think Christians have to have a very clear framework of what it means to be created in God's image, what it means to be saved by God, what it means to do community life together, and how we can advocate for the most voiceless in the public square. And I think the voices that say, well, unless you're advocating for absolutely every other voice, you can't speak about that, I don't think that's a valid argument.
No. So what are some of the concrete steps we might take? What do you reckon?
I think we need to be gracious and generous to people who've had an abortion. I just have to say that. what else should we be?
Yeah, I mean, I had a real mindset shift in this quite a while ago, where someone said to me, David, the women are almost always victims here as well. They've been duped into thinking this is a good thing for them. They've been persuaded by this whole swim of the culture that we've been talking about, that this is a right and a good choice. And afterwards, something kicks in for so many of them, and they realize it wasn't. And the abortion centers that were so keen to help them are nowhere after that. Yeah.
Well, it's a bit like a detransitioning issue as well.
Yeah.
Go there, and then go, maybe I regret that. We don't want to know you. Yeah. And so I would say there needs to be a voice for women to express the pain of that and the regret, which is not judgmental, but which is saying, yes, there's you feel pain and regret because it was a big issue, but there's grace going forward. The culture doesn't give you that, and doesn't have a place outside the good news story of pro-choice. And I think we would do well to figure out how we write and think about this, and how we tell narrative stories better than have been told to us, because it's a very compelling narrative in the culture that we're picking up about this will liberate you.
And yet we're not getting into it. Here's a question without notice, Steve. Have a chew on this one. When the abortion legislation went through the New South Wales Parliament a number of years ago, I went to the first ever public protest and demonstration I've ever been to. But I went out on a cold winter night to Martin Place and stood with thousands, or as the Sydney Morning Herald put it, more than 100 people out there protesting. But you know what was really interesting is the Protestants weren't there. I mean, very few of them.
I think I was in Sydney at the time.
Why do you think that was?
Why do I think that was? Because we're at the center of the culture, and we don't want to be marginalized. So minority Christian groups are more vociferous about this because they have a bigger view of community and family life and the sanctity of humanity. They're not marinated in expressive individualism like we are. So we tend to go in from a negative perspective, going, I've got to get the bar to zero, where they're going, hey, we're not losing any kudos by standing here and having our face filmed and shown at school tomorrow morning if I'm a 18-year-old person protesting. We feel we've got more to lose than they do. And I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Wilberforce, when he started his campaign, was very marginalised. By the end of it, well, it passed Parliament. So maybe there's a lesson there of the long hard slog and being prepared to be unpopular. Yet again, that's part of being a dual citizen, isn't it? Any more thoughts on this, Steve? We're kind of wrapping it up.
Yeah, I would say a good situation to be in is to be gracious towards those who've suffered it, be clear about it, that we believe differently to the culture on it, and be prepared to take a hit for the team going forward, because I think history will judge us kindly as well as the age to come.
Yeah, we've got a better story to tell on this one, I think, and ultimately that may be what resonates. We'll see. Thank you for listening or watching this episode of Dual Citizens. We've been talking about abortion, and we recognize that is for many people a difficult or even very painful topic, and it could have been raising some issues and emotions for you. If that's you, we want to encourage you not to be alone in that. Reach out to a good friend, perhaps talk to your pastor. We'd recommend that. And particularly, there are some great Christian crisis pregnancy organizations out there. Do be in contact with one of them and talk through what's going on for you. And most of all, of course, we want to encourage you. Ask the Lord Jesus Christ to help you by his Spirit in this. He is very, very clear. There is a peace that passes all understanding that can guard our hearts and minds. And maybe today is the day to particularly ask him for that. Thanks for watching Dual Citizens. I'm David Ould.
And I'm Stephen McAlpine.
If you like what you've watched, please do subscribe. Maybe even just leave a review or some comments. Make sure other people can hear about it as well.
Because we need more friends.
We need lots more friends.
He needs more friends.